Today's video is going to be a fun one. I'm going to be ranking all of my Natasha Denona palettes, all 17 of them. This video was very highly requested by you guys, especially in the comments of my recent eyeshadow palette declutter video. And I've been wanting to do this video for a while now because I just love Natasha Denona palettes. I'm at a point now where I kind of collect them and I do get excited for a new palette launch. I am on her PR list, so most of these palettes were sent to me in PR, but whenever a new palette comes out, I try my best to do quite a bit of content with it. If you are interested in any of these palettes and you want to see some of my tutorials or videos with the palettes, you can just search the name of the palette in my YouTube search bar and all of my videos with that palette will pop up. And if by the end of this video you find out you're kind of interested in one of these palettes, I do have a code that works on her website. It's just Angela Bright and that'll save you some money. All right, let's start this ranking. So I have 17 of her palettes, but I do also have 2 of her mini palettes, and I couldn't really include these in the overall ranking because I feel like you can't compare a little palette like this to a full-size palette. But I will say that I do love both of these mini palettes that I have. I have the mini My Dream and then the newest mini Eye Sculpt. I actually bought both of these ones myself. This is a palette that I use a lot more kind of in my day-to-day life, but I do tend to mix this palette with another palette that has some shimmers in it. Like, this isn't a palette I would really wear a lot on its own. So I do really like the new mini Eye Sculpt palette, but because this is an all matte palette, I find that I'm always pairing it with another palette to add some shimmery shades. But these are really good, just staple neutral brown shades. But I think if out of these 2 mini palettes, I would probably pick the My Dream one just because you are getting 3 mattes and 2 shimmers, so you kind of have a full little palette right here. And because you kind of have a light, medium, and deep matte shade, 2 shimmers, you can create kind of a variety of looks with this little palette. So I do love both of these and I do get a lot of use out of them, but if I had to pick one out of these 2, it'd probably go to the mini My Dream. Okay, but now let's move on to the actual eyeshadow palettes. We're gonna go all the way from number 17 all the way to number 1. So obviously my ranking is gonna be based off of my personal preferences and the eyeshadow shades that I like to wear right now. But I will say that all of these palettes are good palettes. Natasha Denona does have a fantastic eyeshadow formula, so like none of the palettes are bad. It's really just based on my personal preference and color stories. But I was kind of struggling with how to rank the bottom 5 palettes because I was looking at them and I was like, well, I don't really use a lot of these, but I kind of asked myself, if all 5 of these palettes were sitting in front of me, which one would I grab first, then second, and kind of went from there. So in 17th place is the Biba palette, and I know that some of you are going to be like, what? Because this is a neutral palette. Oh my gosh, mine is so old and squeaky. Sounds like a creaky old man. The reason why this palette is ranked the lowest for me, because yes, this is a neutral palette, but a lot of these shades pull very, very warm and orange, which are just shades that I don't like to wear nowadays. So then aside from all of the warmer shades you have in here, you have these 2 more gray shades. This shade is a black that fell out and shattered, so it's missing in my palette. But I also don't really wear gray shades either. So I was like, if this palette is in front of me, I really wouldn't want to use it. Honestly, the only shades I could see myself using like today if I were to use this palette would be the shimmer shade Monroe and maybe Shine right here. But this is a pretty old palette from her, and I do think she has created better neutral palettes since Biba. Number 16 is gonna go to the Bronze palette. So same kind of deal as a Biba palette. This palette is just so warm for me, and I don't wear these shades anymore. Now, if you were to ask me in like 2015, 2016, how much would I use this palette? Probably every freaking day. Because back then, warm eyeshadow was so popular and like that was all I would wear. I just way prefer softer, more neutral shadows nowadays. Again, not a bad palette, just not a color story I wear. Number 15 is another older palette I have from her, and that's gonna be the Metropolis palette. I'm pretty sure you can't get this palette anymore. That's how old it is, but I think this is a fun palette. There is a lot going on in here though, where again, you have a lot more of those like orangey warm shades, a warm yellow, red, but then you kind of have a mixture of greens up in here, some kind of bluish green shades. So there's a lot happening. So I asked myself, if I had this palette in front of me today, what kind of look would I do? And again, I wouldn't really use any of the warm orangey shades. I'm mostly drawn to the kind of muted like army green shades up here. I think they're a really kind of fun wearable shade of green. So again, same kind of thing. I don't really wear these shades anymore, but I do appreciate the variety of looks you could get from this palette. Palette number 14 is going to be the Love palette. I love the idea of this palette, and while I don't really get a lot of use out of it anymore, I do just kind of like the overall theme of it being love and like kind of Valentine's Day like. It's a very pretty themed palette, and I always think about this palette when February comes around, but I just know myself and I know that I wouldn't get a lot of use out of these shades because some of these shades shades are pretty bright and pigmented and just like very in your face. And again, that's just not my style nowadays. But I do really like the different types of shimmer shades you have in this palette. I think they're all really pretty. The one shade I just hate in this palette is this shade Dream right here. I really dislike her cream to powder formula, and she's been doing it a lot less nowadays. But I was always so upset about that because I love this color Dream. I just don't like the formula. So that is the Love palette. Number 13 is going to be the Pastel palette. Okay, you might be like, Angela, how did this colorful palette rank higher than the Bronze and the Biba palette? Well, let me tell you. I surprisingly get a little bit of use out of this palette each year, especially around the springtime. When spring rolls around, I love doing a soft, colorful eye look, and I'll find myself reaching into this palette for like a pastel shade to pop in my inner corner, one of these shades on the lower lash line for a little pop of color. Like honestly, those last 4 palettes I just mentioned, I really don't use in my collection, but this one I do use. And I like it too because it is a unique color story. I only have one other pastel palette in my collection, so I like this one. Number 12 is gonna go to her newest midi palette, and that is the Roxa palette. I remember when we first saw this palette being announced, I was so excited for it. I like purple shadow a lot. Like I just have a special place in my heart for purple eyeshadow. And I was like, yes, Natasha's doing a purple palette, and it was a little disappointing. It's not like this shade of purple palette. I wanted like a royal, deep, rich, purple, lavender palette, where this one pulls a lot more pink and lilac-y. So while I don't love the entire color story, there are some really fun shades in here, like these marbled one right here, and these shimmers are very, very intense. One of the biggest things that I didn't really like about this palette is that these 3 matte shades right here like look so different in the pan, but on the eyes, they looked so similar. So I do wish there was a bit more variety in this palette, and I think she could make a better purple palette. But I am thinking about pulling out this palette and doing like a lilac Valentine's Day look pretty soon. I don't know, we'll see. Palette 11 is gonna be the Gold palette. This is a pretty old palette from her, but I really do love this color story, and I did get so much use out of it back when this was like in its prime. Like I've been saying, I like more neutrally brown shades. Like these browns are so gorgeous right here, and my favorite part about this palette are these 2 kind of more greenish shimmers. They just really stand out to me. And then personally, I'm not super into gold shadows, so there were a few kind of goldish shades in here. I think this one I never really got a lot of use out of. And then I know I've done some looks with this palette where I'm using this deeper blue shade as a lower lash line shade, and it just looks so pretty, especially with those shimmers I just pointed out. Now this was such a popular palette for her that she did release the Golden palette that is kind of the sister palette to this one that we will talk about later. But I really do love this color story. Number 10 is going to be the Glam Face palette, and I have the one in light. Now this was a good launch from her. Earlier in 2024, she released the Hyper Natural Face palette, and I actually ended up decluttering that one because it just was not a good palette. There was like cream shadows in there, and then the pan sizes for the blush and bronzer were so freaking small, it was just really hard to use. Whereas in this face palette, you're getting a good size blush, a good size highlighter that you can fit a face brush into, and then these 5 shadows make a really gorgeous kind of peachy toned look. I'm actually not sure if you can still get this palette. I think you can, but there is also a deeper version too if you have a deeper skin tone. But I think if you're someone that likes to kind of wear the same look every day, you just like to stick to some staple products, you would really like this. So now at this point, we're kind of in the middle of the ranking. We have 9 palettes left, and all of these palettes are good palettes. I like all of these. I get use out of all of them, but I'd say with these next 9 palettes, they are all solid palettes. I love all of them, and if you're finding a color story that you would like in one of these, I would highly recommend it. So palette number 9 is I Need a Warm. And again, you might be, Angela, you just talked for so long about how you don't like warm eyeshadows. I know. These aren't orangey warm shadows, they are peachy warm shadows. Let me quickly show you I Need a Warm and the Bronze palette. There is a huge difference between the tone of the shadows in these 2 palettes. Again, a lot of the shades in Bronze have some red, some orangey warmth to them, where some of these shades are warm, but they just lean more peachy, which I think looks a lot softer on the eyes. And then there are also shades in the I Need a Warm palette that aren't super warm. You have some kind of more neutral shades down here. I think my favorite part about this palette are the shimmer shades. I am a sucker for a beautiful light shimmer shade on the eyelid, and this palette is full of those kind of shades. I would say though that there isn't a lot of variety in this palette. I found that each look that I create with this palette they look kind of similar, you know? But some people might like that, especially if this is a color story that really calls to you. But I am so excited to break out this palette more in the summer months. Palette number 8 is going to be the Xenon palette. Now, to be so real with you, this isn't a palette that I use a lot, but I'm placing it at number 8 because I think it's a very unique palette. Like, I don't have any other palettes in my collection like this that have this kind of gray scale of shadows. I swear, every time I look at this, I feel like I'm looking at a black and white photo. It honestly kind of messes with my brain a bit. So while I don't use this palette a lot, I do do know that if I ever want to do a silver or kind of white eye look, this is the palette to grab for. My favorite shade in the palette is this one on the bottom right, Skill. It just has the perfect amount of champagne in it while also being really neutral. Again, a lot of the shimmers in this palette are really standouts for me. Palette number 7 is the Retro palette. I think this is just a beautiful color story. You have a little bit of some pink, kind of mauve-y, rosy tones in this palette, but I don't think they're scary colors at all. I do think this palette is very wearable and appropriate for every day or even going to work. Whenever I open this palette, I'm just so drawn to these two pinky shimmers up there. Okay, wait, maybe I want to grab this for a Valentine's Day look with like the softer mauve tones. I kind of like that. I just love looking at this palette. It just gives me soft romantic vibes. Lucky palette number 6. 6 is my favorite number, is going to be the Glam palette. This is such a staple, neutral, cool toned leaning color story. You kind of have everything you need in here to create a large variety of looks. I like that this is a neutral palette, but there's still a bit of variety with the tones you get in this palette. You have some kind of more pinky shade right here. You got some champagne, more of a bronzy gold, something a bit more silver and gray. Like, you kind of can do a lot with this palette. This is also a very beginner friendly palette in the way that she named the shadows. So for example, you have crease, center eyelid, inner corner, outer eyelid, but of course you can place the shades wherever you want on your eye. But I think if you're someone that looks at a palette and you just get very overwhelmed by it, this kind of tells you where to place the shadows. Highly, highly recommend this one. Okay, we are in the top 5 now. Spot number 5 is gonna go to the Retro Glam palette. That might have been confusing with having the Retro palette, the Glam palette, and now the Retro Glam palette. Even I get confused with that sometimes. But I love this color story. I always feel so inspired looking at it because you kind of have a couple different things going on in here. You have these beautiful kind of minty shades right here with some deeper shades of green. You have a tiny bit of pink in here with this pop of red, and then also some nice neutral shades in here that just kind of tie the palette together. One of my favorite shades in this palette is Flutter right here. It is such the perfect inner corner highlight shade. It is bright and pigmented and white, and I love it. But kind of same thing I was saying with the Pastel palette. I really like using these shades right here, maybe as a pop in the inner corner in the spring. It's just a fun one to play with, and just looking at it now makes me want to use it again. Be prepared for some Natasha Denona throwback videos. I can just feel them coming. Palette number 4 is going to be the My Dream palette. This was my number 1 ranked palette of 2022. I have done so many looks with this palette, and I actually recently did one in December during my half 12 days of tutorials, and it's probably my favorite look I've done with this palette. Search it on my channel, it's beautiful. But I like this palette a lot because, again, you can create a wide variety of looks out of it. So there are a few warmer shades down here that I don't get a lot of use out of. I do use this Carpe Diem shade with Unity a lot because those two lean kind of more peachy. You also have this kind of multi-chrome shifty shade. I love the little pops of this kind of pink and purple in here that really tie it all together. And then of course the matte black up here, Blackest Black, is probably the blackest shadow I have in my collection. It's so funny because I remember when I received this palette in PR in 2022, I opened it up and I was like, this is it. This is the eyeshadow palette, and I really did love this one for so long. In third place is going to be the Yucca palette. I just love how unique this color story is, and whenever I look at this palette, I just get like, honestly, like a fuzzy feeling inside. That sounds so dumb, but it's the truth. This palette just makes me want to be creative, and it's really different than any other palette I have in my collection. This palette might look kind of intimidating, but because these greenish shades kind of lean more on the mucky side, it has a little bit of brown and yellow in them, they're actually pretty wearable shades. Again, I'm a sucker for Natasha Denona shimmers, and the shimmers in this palette are just absolutely everything. They look so freaking good all over the lid. I know I've also used this Camu shade right here in the inner corner for kind of like a neon pop. It's so gorgeous. This is just such a fun palette from Natasha, so that's why it is number 3. There are 2 palettes left. We have the Golden Palette and the I Need A Nude palette. So who came first? I Need A Nude. That means number 2 is Golden, so let's talk about her. But like I said earlier, this Golden palette is kind of the re-released sister palette to the Gold palette. I did a very in-depth video on the Golden palette when it came out, and I compared these 2 palettes side by side because there are a lot of shades in the original Gold palette that are in the Golden palette. I know a lot of people didn't like that she took out kind of the fun greenish blue shades in here, but honestly, I love that she did that because I think this is a stunning color story. What I like about this palette is that it leans kind of more on the lighter side, which is how I've been liking to do my shadow recently. Really, this shade right here is kind of the deepest I would go with an eye look. If you're someone that likes softer, lighter eye looks, I think you would love this. My favorite part, again, has to be the shimmery shades in here. Fizzy, Kava, Aura, Nubia. Oh my gosh, I love all of them so much. But this is another palette where you're not going to get a large variety of looks, especially because like these kind of 4 matte brown shades right here look very, very similar in the crease. But I think if you're someone that likes to do the same kind of look every day you have a style and look you like to stick to, and these shades are part of that, I think you would love this. All right, we already established that the #1 palette is I Need A Nude. I swear this palette broke the frickin' internet when it came out. So I picked this palette as #1 because it has earned a place on top of my desk, which is where I only keep palettes that, you know, I'm grabbing for pretty frequently. And it is just so easy for me to dip into this palette. I love these kind of softer taupey shades for the crease. I love the more cool tone vibes that they have. I think this was the first palette where she introduced her kind of more sheer topper formula, like the shade of Sheen and Mia right here. They are so gorgeous. I love the kind of scattered sparkle look. This center shade at Muse right here is one of my favorite shimmer shades Natasha has created. Like, if I had to pick my favorite shimmer out of all her palettes, it's probably this one. And I like this one too because you can get a little variety out of it. You have these kind of two peachier shades right here if you want to do something a tad bit warmer. But the overall vibe of this palette is just soft and taupey, which is really what I like to wear nowadays. I also really love that there's a light vanilla shade in this palette. This is a type of shadow that I use so frequently in my looks to just kind of blend out the edges. And then of course having a deeper shade like this silhouette one up here is perfect for lining the lash line. I just think this palette is absolutely stunning, and if I had to recommend one Natasha Denona palette to you, it'd probably be this one. That was so fun to go through and rank all of my Natasha Denona palettes. If you disagree or agree with me on any of my rankings, I would love to know your thoughts. I'd also love to know if any of these palettes were new to you. Have you not seen all of these before? Did any of them catch your attention? Let me know. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Do not drop these. I've done this before. Oh my gosh, this is so heavy. Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. These are like my children. Okay, I got a good grip, don't worry.